All right, this is one of our final topics, or possibly the final topic on land system change. So for this first planetary boundaries, and note we're going to talk about aquaculture and fisheries, which is not actually land system change. So why do I put it in here? Because I want to show you the parallels between human impact on land ecosystems and habitat and human impact on marine ecosystems and habitat. You will note that the only ways that water is incorporated into the planetary boundaries is through ocean acidification and freshwater use. There is biosphere integrity as well, which would address kind of the flora and fauna changes in the ocean. So I just want to bring this out because sometimes when we think about the system change and the ways that humans have encroached upon different systems of the planet, it's easy to forget about what is most of the planet, which is our marine systems. Here are the objectives and the goals. As usual, I post them for you to be able to test your learning throughout the lecture, and particularly to go back and use as reflection points at the end to think through what you've learned and make sure that it all seems to make sense. You should always be able to answer these at the end of any lecture. This comes from, so down here you see the citation, the article that this comes from. It is an equivalent approach to marine ecosystems that we read in the Ellis and Ramankutty article about the anthromes and land system change. So essentially using a coarse analysis to try to understand how humans have impacted the marine ecosystems across the globe. And so you can just see here that according to this color chart, the red being very high impact and blue being very low impact, and the ways in which human impacts are distributed across the globe. You should note here that these bright red areas bright dark red, I guess, areas being the areas of very highest impact, and note that they're all along the coastline. That is because humans, first, we're going to be dumping more pollution directly into coastlines. And at the same time, we're going to be, that's where our most intensive fishing occurs. You can see some of these are blown up here below, so you can see them in a little bit more detail. This is a different chart from that same article. And I posted up here so to a little bit of practice looking at complicated charts. What we can see here are different aspects of marine ecosystems that are impacted and how extensive that impact is, okay? What we're seeing here again are these summed threat scores. So if you look down here, total affected area and summed threat scores. So the black bars are the threat scores and the gray bars are the total affected area for anthropogenic drivers, and then just for all coastal regions, right? And so what we're seeing here is that, you know, sea temperature, ocean acidification, note those have their own, this one has its own planetary boundary. These are some pretty major factors impacting the ocean ecosystems. These would be under the concept of climate change. And then what we're seeing here of human impacts on fisheries. Okay, so what are the more fishing impacts on these marine ecosystems? And then finally, pollution. This would be a generally lower threat than these other factors that we're seeing here. So this is just showing us generally what are the impacts. This is a little bit outdated, so this is up to 2004, but it's showing us global fisheries, right? So I have the citation down here, and what global fisheries are looking like and in terms of the catches. So note just a few things here is the different types of fish that are being caught, and then what we're here, and these are, and then our other catches, and then what we have here is that what I want you to notice too are discards. So these are fish that are just being tossed back into the ocean or bycatch, so it's waste, and they're not living through this process. The other thing that I want you to really notice about this is that you've seen a growth, and you can actually mark here that overall we're going to see this sort of exponential growth curve that in the last 30 years has really leveled off. So here's another one, a little bit more going into 2010 of world fish production. And again, you can see that there is overall an exponential growth, but it started to level off with this is really more of a linear growth, but it started to level off with wild fish catch being supplanted by aquaculture. So you're seeing this huge increase in aquaculture, and that is what is accounting for the increase in total fish production. But our wild fish catch has actually leveled off, and that's because we have massively started to overfish our fisheries. So we're not able to catch as many fish as we once were. Here is, this is actually, you can click on this link. I highly suggest that you do, because it takes you to World Bank data, and there's just, I really like that World Bank repository of data. There's so much data that you can look at that's on this very kind of coarse scale. You know, they get these, they get this data from individual countries and then compile it together. But this one is showing you capture fisheries production, so wild catch. And you can see just that trend has continued on into the present, in which we are no longer increasing or catching more fish every year. And very likely we're actually catching total same amounts, but we're catching smaller and smaller fish and different types of fish that we did not, that might have been considered kind of junk fish before. And that's how we've been able to maintain these fisheries that are actually being driven into collapse. This is a different article down here. If you note, I didn't have you read a bunch of different articles about fisheries, so I have a lot summarized here. The main thing I want you to notice here, so what you're looking at are taxa collapse. So a taxa being a categorization of different species of fish, right? So your kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, Linnaeus classification system. So a taxa would be a group of those fish. And what we're seeing here is that these are collapsing. So the diamonds are collapses by year, and triangles are cumulative collapses. And a little bit counterintuitive, you have to notice that the collapsed taxa it's inversely graphed. So as you go down, you're actually getting more and more collapsed taxa, right? So what we're seeing is cumulatively, we're seeing now up to 80% of fish have actually begun to collapse, which essentially means that they will not, in terms of population dynamics of a marine ecosystem, that you're leaving so few in the ocean that it's thought that they will not actually be able to recover their own populations. And these sort of, so you're driving a lot of these fishes into extinction. I post this in here. There's an article embedded here. You may or may not have heard about shark finning. It was a hot topic for a while in terms of animal rights activism. It's a pretty brutal process of what happens because it is not profitable to actually carry an entire shark on board. It is more profitable to just take their fins, particularly the dorsal fin, which is the one on their back. So people who who practice shark finning actually catch the shark, they cut off the fin, and then they drop the shark back into the water, and it is no longer able to swim, so it sinks to the bottom of the ocean without the movement. It's not able to get oxygen out of the water, and it suffocates and also bleeds. It's a pretty, it's gotten a lot of attention from the media because of the pretty brutal treatment of the sharks. It's also extremely wasteful. You're killing all these sharks for this very small part of their bodies. But there's a high demand for shark fin in some places. And so that's really been driving this industry, despite the fact that many places have tried to outlaw or place limits on this practice. So this is kind of a elementary slide, but I keep it in here because it shows the different ways in which we are currently getting fish. So there's the trawling, there's sonar, there's drift net fishing, there's this long line fishing, and then there's a few different ocean fish farming, and we'll look at land fish farming as well. And there's a lot of waste produced in commercial fisheries. So this is called bycatch. And some fisheries, you can come up to 80% of it being bycatch, which just means that you're trying to catch a certain species or a certain group of species, and you end up with all these other fish that are wasted or thrown out in the process. If you notice on that chart, it does seem that bycatch is potentially decreasing, probably because of finding different uses for these. But again, you're in the ocean and these big ocean vessels. And so you often don't want to, you have to be concerned about things like volume and weight. And so, the fish are killed in bycatch, and they just would typically throw them back overboard rather than thinking about what to do with them, a kind of analogous to the shark finning process. And then there's our charismatic species that get caught up in this, and sometimes the general populace maybe raises a little bit more alarm. And so here's a sea turtle. Sea turtles can get caught in bottom trawling. They can also get caught in line fisheries. For a while, dolphins were getting caught in nets, and there was a huge campaign. This is now about 25 years old for dolphin safe tuna. And so you hear less about that now because they've potentially changed the nets. It's also possible the public just shifted their focus. This is kind of a self-explanatory slide. So let's move to this last little topic here, which is aquaculture. Aquaculture, you saw in those earlier slides, is a vastly growing industry, very quickly growing. And the question is it the solution? Is it the solution to this diminishing this diminishing fisheries? Here, some of the problems with aquaculture. So here's an example. I've just got some pictures of what aquaculture might look like. Some of the problems that we can experience with aquaculture, a big one is many of the fish that we actually want to farm are carnivores. And that means that we need to catch smaller fish in the fisheries in order to feed them to these larger fish in aquaculture tanks. So in that sense, and the video posted showed this as well, it is not necessarily considered a sustainable approach since you're ultimately catching fish so that you can grow fish. Here is another. So sometimes aquaculture, rather than being offshore, like in this picture, you can have aquaculture in tanks directly in a sort of kind of harbor type area where you would be growing fish, cultivating. And you note these nets here so that the fish will not escape into the sea. One potential problem with this, of course, is you would be producing lots of concentrated fish excrement and waste, which would create high zones of really high nitrogen zones, but also high pollution zones in these areas, in these coastal waters. So here is an example of a GMO fish, so genetically modified organism that salmon. This is now, I want to say this is maybe 2 or 3 years old, that this Aqua Advantage, sorry, the marketing makes me laugh. The Aqua Advantage salmon is safe to eat as non-genetically modified salmon. And as I recall, you can click on this and it'll take you to the article, but as I recall, this was the example of a fish that was actually modified so that it could grow faster and it could also eat food. Salmon are carnivorous fish, but I believe this was actually modified so it could eat corn and other grains. So again, here's an example of genetic modification of an organism that might potentially solve some problems, but of course there's concerns associated with with GMOs in general. One major concern, which you note here, is that if there's concerns about these genetically modified organisms escaping into the wild and then outcompeting the quote natural species that exist, and so ultimately potentially drastically altering your local ecosystem. I couldn't leave without some pictures of tilapia ponds. Tilapia ponds are very pervasive in Costa Rica, and they, again, a good way to grow fish. I keep saying grow. Cultivate fish. They tend to be inland in these types of ponds. They do produce a lot of waste, can have some issues in terms of odor and other wastes for the nearby communities. But if you eat tilapia, we grow a lot of it in Costa Rica right now. And then, so here's just a nice little summary. You're going to see these on some slides, which are just these trade-offs, this sort of textbook trade-offs of aquaculture, right? So what are some of the potential advantages and disadvantages that we're getting from converting to these aquaculture systems? I posted this because this again is a slide you can click on, but this is where we're getting to this issue of solutions, right? What do we do about, again, the fact that we need to feed the planet? Fish are a source of food for the planet and a source that a lot of people enjoy. However, at the same time, fisheries have impacts. And so one way to protect fisheries is to create protected reserves. Part of the idea of marine protected reserves or areas is that you're allowing a place where the fish can successfully reproduce. So if you don't fish in those areas, you're creating a little bit of a safe haven for them to then go back and repopulate these fisheries with the protected fish. There's also a lot of political approaches to protecting fish. There's some famous examples. For example, in Maine, there was an anthropologist, James Atchison, who did a lot of research on what he published a book called The Lobster Gangs of Maine, which was basically how these people were able to successfully create sort of a common pool resource organization in which they kept out outsiders and actually did a good job protecting the species and allowing those fisheries to not get over-collapsed or overfished and therefore subject to collapse. There's a lot of interesting economic incentives. It's some of the most creative economic incentives have been applied to fisheries. And so there are interesting ideas out there. But if we do nothing, then they likely will collapse on their own in the face of global markets. Eco-labeling is an interesting approach. So trying to support sustainable seafood. We do a bit of that here in at Furman, right? So Bon Appetit has a big effort to support sustainable seafood initiatives. A lot of local restaurants that'll support kind of sustainable agriculture. They'll look into their sourcing and support sustainable seafood. You can try to support sustainable seafood by researching where things are coming from that you buy at a market. So here's some of the stuff with managing. So here's some of the sort of overall potential solutions. So you can have catch limits. You can have these economic approaches, which are fairly complicated to explain in such a short lecture, but there's essentially, there's sustainable fisheries. There's also things where you can kind of give people ownership to limit the amount of permits you have. You can offer protected areas. You can educate your consumer. You can set net limits to prevent the bycatch. And then there's also aquaculture and those sorts of approaches. All right, so that was just an overview of your fisheries. Hopefully that you can think about some of the comparisons of the human impact on fisheries with the human impact on land systems and see how all of this is really driven by our need to produce food for a growing populace.